Hi, Gershom.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's good to talk to you again.
Good to talk to you. It's been a while. I should introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Gershom Gorenberg in Israel, where you live, and of the blog South Jerusalem. You write for the American Prospect. You've written several books, and you've got one coming out in November called the Unmaking of Israel.
That's correct.
On the crisis of Israeli democracy and how to solve it. And the subject of that, I'm sure, will one way or another come into play in this conversation. One reason I wanted to talk to you again is because there's been kind of a whirlwind of activity involving Israel and Palestine, and to some extent the United States. I mean, I guess, which was the first of the things? I mean, if you look at the last 10 days, there was the Nakba commemoration by the Palestinians, where you saw kind of unprecedented thing, or protests of unprecedented breadth, I would say, by Palestinians, not just in the occupied territories, but in countries adjacent to Israel. Then you had Obama's big Middle East speech, where he tried to give new impetus to a two-state resolution. Then you had Prime Minister Netanyahu come to Washington, have a chilly encounter with Obama. Obama spoke before AIPAC. Netanyahu spoke before AIPAC. Netanyahu spoke before Congress and established that he's much more beloved in Congress than Obama is. It goes on, and all this is against the backdrop, of course, of this looming prospect of the Palestinians in September trying to get the United Nations to recognize a Palestinian state along 1967 borders. So,
right, and I would just add two more things to that,
okay,
which is that before going to Washington, Netanyahu spoke before the Knesset to lay out his political stance. And, of course, there was also Obama's general speech on the Middle East at the State Department last week.
Right. I mentioned that briefly, right. But go ahead, yeah.
So both on the ground in terms of a different form of Palestinian protest last week, and in terms of diplomacy, political positioning, speeches, it's been a very intense week and a half, and that would seem to only be a prelude, as you've pointed out, to a great deal of activity likely leading up to September and the United Nations.
Yeah, and the connection between those two, between the UN thing in September and all of this going on now, is that the Palestinians say that, if there is real progress in peace talks, then they might not seek this resolution, but if there is none, then they will. And tell me if I'm being too pessimistic in my interpretation of this, but it seems to me that Netanyahu's visit pretty much removed all doubt that there will be no progress in peace talks between now and September. Is that, and that in fact he wants that? I mean that seems to be his choice is to. I came away with being more certain than ever that he does not want a two-state solution, and that, moreover, he doesn't even want to go through a kind of charade between now and September about pretending to want one, enough to actually forestall that September vote. Now, am I too negative a person?
I'd break that into two pieces. First of all, let's look at Netanyahu. I would agree with your evaluation of his view of a two-state agreement. The idea that he's accepting a two-state agreement was twisted out of him by Obama 2 years ago at the beginning of Netanyahu's term. However, the conditions that he's laid on a two-state solution are such that the Palestinian state would look very little like a state, and his conditions are ones that are far short of anything that's come up in serious negotiations since Oslo until today. So when he says yes, he means no. Netanyahu is committed to the idea of permanent Israeli control of the area between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. If he wants to talk about a Palestinian state, basically what he's talking about is something short of a state in a fraction of the territory, which he once called autonomous areas, and now he's willing to call a state. But the practical differences between the two are minimal. And his speech to his speech to Congress made that more clear than ever, in the guise of a speech that was played up as being the speech of his life, where he was going to make major new diplomatic proposals. He basically clung to his old position.
Yeah.
So that leaves the question of whether anything can happen between now and September. And I would say that pessimism is justified, but there are a variety of players who could make a difference in that situation.
But I'll tell you, before you share that source of optimism with me, I want to tell you my pessimism actually goes deeper than I'm saying. I increasingly don't see a way that Israel remains a Jewish state and a democracy in a meaningful sense of the term. Or maybe I should just say a state where you'd want to live. You know, I mean, I just see a downward spiral from here on in. And I can explain why later, but I just want to establish that's the kind of pessimism that I want you to wrench me out of, okay? So now you can proceed and tell me, just to get back to this question of who could impart, you know, some sort of momentum to peace talks between now and September, who are these people who could plausibly make a difference?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I've always regarded pessimism as a luxury of people at a distance.
Well, I'm indulging in it fully, I assure you.
Since I live here, and my family lives here, and I have 2 children serving in the Israeli army right now.
And you have served in the Israeli army, right?
I served in the reserves. I came here at an age where they did not draft me into regular service, but I served in the reserves. I have my 2 older children are serving in the army now as draftees, and I therefore do not allow myself the luxury of pessimism, which I regard as a form of political laziness in which one can indulge.
Now, Gershom, I will contest that accusation later. But anyway, go ahead and cheer me up.
When one is at a long distance from the events, when you're close up, you just can't take the time for pessimism. You have to look for where things can be changed.
Okay.
I want to, before getting into where things can be changed, though, I want to underline some of the details of the problem that we saw in Mr. Netanyahu's speech to Congress. And honestly, I don't know who should be more embarrassed by that event. Israelis for watching their prime minister selling imitation snake oil on a diplomatic basis, or Americans for watching their elected representatives stand up and applaud 29 times for the opportunity to buy imitation snake oil. So it was an extremely embarrassing event to watch. It was like watching one of those movies where people are doing stupid things and you keep feeling sorry for them. I'd like to point out some of the issues that came up in that speech. Mr. Netanyahu said that besides holding on to something that would make Israel's borders more defensible in 1967, he would hold on to other places of strategic and historic importance. And he did not detail that, but that's basically what he was saying is, at a minimum, he wants to hold on to the larger settlements, and he also wants to hold on to places that he considers historically important to the Jewish people. His government has voted in the past, for instance, to declare the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron as a national heritage site. So one wonders, one has to take seriously the possibility that what he intends is fingers of Israeli territory reaching out to Hebron, as well as to settlements deep in the West Bank.
Now that's a question. That's a technical question I have. So he is not envisioning any islands. You think? You think these settlements far from the 67 borders? He imagines hanging onto a strip of land that extends all the way out to them?
Well, theoretically, as we both agreed before, I think he knows that this proposal is a non-starter, and he's perfectly happy with that. But that's the way his plan sounded. Now, whether they were islands or tendrils clearly, that kind of territorial arrangement would be far less defensible.
Sure.
It would be a military planner's nightmare.
Sure.
So there's a contradiction built into that. Ironically, by the way, Netanyahu vastly exaggerated the number of Israelis living over the Green Line, the pre-1967 border. He put it at 650,000. More reasonable numbers based on government figures would put it just over 500,000. He referred to those as people living there as demographic changes that have occurred since 1967, as if the Israeli government, and particularly his own governments, had no role in that expansion. He talked about the improvement in Palestinian economic conditions without, and partly because of the removal of roadblocks, as if those roadblocks had just ended up there by accident, or were left over from Jordanian rule or something like that. He did not mention that part of the reason that violence has dropped in the last several years is because of close cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and Israel on stopping terror attacks. So the picture he painted of reality and of a possible agreement were distinctly warped. And one has to wonder whether the representatives and senators who kept jumping up to applaud him were ignorant of the facts, or were simply ignoring them for what they thought was political benefit. In either case, by doing so, they were leaping into the politics of Israel, giving Netanyahu more street cred at home. And damaging the possibility of reaching a peace agreement and a two-state arrangement. I find that depressing. I would almost indulge in pessimism were I to be able to allow myself that luxury.
Can I ask you, before you cheer me up, can I ask you a cynical question? I think we agree that his performance increases the chances that the September resolution will happen at the UN, which he purports to not want. I assume he's smart enough to know that. It leads me to believe that he wants that resolution to happen precisely because it will make the Israeli people more freaked out and perhaps in his calculation more, it'll strengthen their allegiance to him.
I'm honestly not sure. This kind of advanced thinking reminds me of when 25 years ago, when my wife and I were several months before our wedding, were shopping for wedding halls in Jerusalem, and we were getting married in June. It was January or February. We were going around and we found one that we liked, and we asked if there were still it was still possible to reserve the hall, and my wife looked at me and said, "What are you talking about? Most of the people who are going to get married on that date haven't met each other yet." Americans tend to have a longer-term view of things. This is a country of improvisation. Right now, Netanyahu is trying to put off peace talks. Whether he's considered what he's going to do about a September resolution in the UN, if it passes, I'm really not certain of that.
Okay.
It's a constant matter of trying to keep the balls in the air and dealing with each crisis as it comes.
Okay.
What is true in this situation is that since coming into office, Netanyahu has treated the Palestinian diplomatic track not as a negotiation or a potential negotiation with the Palestinians, but as a situation in which he needs to convince the United States and to some extent Europe to back him against the Palestinians. And, of course, the irony of this is that in order to do that, he needs to convince the United States and Europe that he would really make peace if it weren't for the Palestinians. The reason that the Palestinians are talking about going to the UN is they've decided to copy the Israeli strategy rather than talking to Israel, which they've come to see as a non-starter. They've decided that they're going to convince the world that they're right and Israel is unwilling to make peace. So this is a totally dysfunctional diplomatic relationship. And in that sense, there's a very serious problem. It does look like under current conditions that that this will come to a vote in the UN in September. If that happens, it's likely that support for a Palestinian state in the General Assembly, at least, would be very strong. And nobody, the Palestinians included, know exactly what the consequences of that would be. Although it's likely that it would leave Israel more diplomatically isolated than ever. Or, to put it differently, Netanyahu is playing with fire here.
Yeah, but it will heighten the siege mentality, and that's what I'm saying might be to his political advantage. But because the Palestinian expectation is that would be followed by an amassing of more and more organized support internationally for the Palestinian state that would assume the form of boycotts and sanctions and so on. That's almost the benign scenario. There's also the scenario where things get, where Israel, goes out and does something to secure the security of the settlements, or where it turns into violence in fairly short order. There's that scenario, but
right. I mean, there's every scenario is possible, from this being a diplomatic declaration like the Palestinian Declaration of Independence in 1988. To, with no change on the ground, with Israeli and Palestinian officers continuing to meet to prevent terror attacks, as they are doing today, and with Palestinian trucks from the West Bank meandering to Israeli checkpoints where they're offloaded, scanned, and the goods put on Israeli trucks. That could happen. Palestinian frustration could lead to massive protests, nonviolent or violent. Nonviolent in the Tahrir Square scenario, or violent in the first or second Intifada scenario. That is to say, either unarmed or armed violence. It could lead to sanctions. In some Palestinian views of the situation, what will lead to is that when negotiations do take place, since Palestine will be recognized as a state according to the pre-67 borders, the negotiations will have to start from there, that Israel will already be forced into that position. These are all possibilities. The Palestinians are taking a huge gamble in trying this strategy. They don't know where it's going to go. But this is sort of their frustration with the diplomatic process, a sense that it's going nowhere. Now, there's a whole backstory to that. If you talk to Israeli and Palestinian officials, as I have, they each blame the other side for the breakdown of negotiations in 2000 and afterwards between Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas. In each case, their stories are, they each tell part of the story in such a way that their side was willing to make peace and the other side wasn't. But in any case, that's where the Palestinians are at. They're willing to take this gamble because they think that, first of all, negotiations with Israel are going nowhere, and second of all, I think this is worth stressing because they think that Barack Obama has let them down, that his promises of working for a two-state solution haven't come through, and that therefore trying to negotiate through the United States isn't working.
Yeah, and I guess the reason it seems to me that the September resolution is going to happen is just because the lines have been drawn, so firmly now. I mean, the Palestinians have said you have to stop settlements before we can talk. Netanyahu says we're not going to stop settlements. And Netanyahu, you emphasized that, you said that the state, the Palestinian state as he's defining it, is just not a state that the Palestinians are going to accept. I would say the roadblocks he's throwing up go beyond that. I mean, for example, his insistence that they say that they recognize the right of a Jewish state to exist. Now, as a practical matter, all they have to do is say that they recognize the right of Israel to exist. We all know what Israel is, right? And he knows that it's very hard for them to say the words Jewish state because, for one thing, there are more than 1 million Palestinians living in Israel proper, and they think for them to say Israel is a Jewish state is to define those Palestinians as second-class citizens. So, I mean, that's a case where it goes well beyond. That seems to be a completely gratuitous demand on his part, and another just more evidence that he is determined that nothing happened between now and September. So, again, I don't see any. I'm ready for you to cheer me up and tell me what could happen.
You've pushed me into explaining again part of the negative side of things before I get to that. So
it's contagious.
Basically, the argument from Netanyahu and from other top Israeli officials is that the Palestinians have shown, according to them in past negotiations, that they're unwilling to reach a full end of the conflict, end to all claims, a resolution to the refugee problem, and that the only way that we can be sure that they're not trying to wipe out Israel as a Jewish state is for them to explicitly recognize Israel as a Jewish state.
Right. This
sells very well domestically, politically, because, in fact, particularly after the Second Intifada and the suicide attacks in Israeli cities, there's a strong degree of doubt in the Israeli public of whether the Palestinians are willing to reach an end to the conflict, and he's putting forward this sort of psychological Rubicon for them to cross that will prove that they're ready. But the real proof that they're ready for an end of conflict and a resolution of the refugee problem is an agreement that includes an end of the conflict and a resolution of the refugee problem. I mean, in other words, it's God is in the details here. If they are willing to negotiate a resolution to those issues, and if they're willing to say this is a final agreement, then you've gotten there. And they don't have to say anything about the internal state of Israel, because they've said that the internal state of Israel is no longer their affair. Mm-hmm. It's basically throwing a spanner in the works. It's a way of avoiding a resolution, and at the same time of attracting domestic political support. Now, I would stress here that both sides, the Israelis and the Palestinians, have suffered from a leadership that has not been sufficiently honest with their publics about what the implications of a final status agreement is. On the Israeli side, the leadership has allowed this illusion to continue that the border is going to be drastically different than it was before 1967, that most of the settlements are going to stay in Israeli hands, that perhaps the security fence running through the West Bank will be Israel's border, and that's a non-starter diplomatically. It's an illusion. On the Palestinian side, even though Palestinian officials in the pro-diplomacy camp of Mahmoud Abbas and Salam Fayyad understand that a peace agreement will mean that a negotiated and probably small number of Palestinian refugees and their descendants will return to Israel, and that the great majority will have to find their homes either in the Palestinian state or elsewhere. Even though they understand that, they have been insufficiently direct with their people, to put it mildly, about that. They're both waiting to have the peace treaty in hand to reveal the full cost to their people.
Right, and there is the argument that it's easier to sell this to your people when you're really close to the finish line, when you can see victory within sight. So there may be some excuse. But
absolutely, that is true. If you had polls done of Israelis in October of 1977, before Sadat came to Jerusalem, when peace was theoretical, showed that most Israelis would not give up the full Sinai for peace with Egypt. After Sadat came to Jerusalem, that changed, because if you say to me, will you spend $500,000 on a house? I'll say, no.
Right.
If you show me the house, I might say, well, for that, I'll take out 4 mortgages.
Right.
I mean, that's an incredible house, right? So there is something to that, but it has made it difficult to create the trust necessary to create the agreement. Okay, so where do we go from here? Let me start perhaps with group one of people that I thought behaved in an embarrassing fashion and gave politics a bad name the other day, and that was the American Congress. It's time to stop this applauding for Bibi's speeches. I presume that in the Congress that at least a large number of the Democrats understand that what they were applauding for is totally unrealistic, that they were playing to the cameras, that they understand that that's not a Palestinian state, and that they even understand that that Netanyahu's program is disastrous for the future of the state of Israel, that it's going to lead Israel to international isolation and to pressure for a binational state in which Jews will be a minority.
I actually doubt that many of them have thought that deeply to understand how bad this really is for Israel.
Okay, you know what?
Yeah.
I'll buy your position. So let's start with them before they put their hands together and applaud. Putting their neurons together and thinking a little bit about this and learning about this having the honesty to say what's going on publicly, which gives
Gershom, I'm
support.
sorry, but I live here, and I've got to say I don't think you're being cynical enough. It's not that if they understood Israel's true interests they would pursue that. It's that what they're focused on is their own political interests, and they are under the perception that AIPAC in particular and its allies will punish them severely if they don't stand up 28 times, and applaud Netanyahu and do various other things. It's that simple. They may be wrong, but I don't know enough about the American political system to honestly know how wrong they are. I mean, sometimes I suspect that the emperor has less clothes than they think in this regard. And that maybe the tide is shifting a little here, but it's not going to do any good for you or me to sermonize. You're going to have to create a climate in which it is not in their perceived political interest to do that.
Well, look, I think part of this is an internal argument, and actually here I think that there's a lot of place for journalists, scholars, pundits, bloggers, etc., to try to change the atmosphere, because I think that the perception I think that AIPAC's power comes in part from nobody willing to discuss how much clothes it has on. There's this perception that the Jews are all going to vote and give to the Republicans if somebody crosses AIPAC.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to go through the whole.
No, but I will say there is a problem. I mean, Peter Beinart wrote this piece. I'm sure that you saw in the New York Review of Books about how the younger American Jews do not buy into the AIPAC line by and large. But he also made the point that they care less and less about affinity with Israel in general. And this is, I think, highlights the problem you face. Yes, there may be fewer and fewer American Jews who identify intensely with the AIPAC position, but they don't identify intensely with opposition to AIPAC either. They're relatively
well. If that's
indifferent.
the case, then who are you pandering to?
Well,
I mean, in other words,
AIPAC's,
first of all, I think
classic...
that the generation thing is somewhat exaggerated here. My late mother didn't agree with the AIPAC position.
Yeah.
I'm sad to say that she's been gone for 5 years, but she didn't accept the AIPAC position either. The AIPAC people are the ones who shout the loudest.
That's my only point, is that it's often the case that policy is held hostage to a minority but intensely motivated group.
Okay.
And so it doesn't really matter whether AIPAC represents a majority of Jewish opinion. If they are way more motivated in terms of deploying resources, to get their will done, that's what matters, and I think that's probably what is the case.
Okay, so part of what you're saying here in response to my comment about Congress, and I'll put an underline under this, is that part of what could make a difference in the Middle East diplomatic situation is whether or not people who care about Israel's survival as a Jewish state and a democracy start making their voices heard more loudly within the
Right.
American political spectrum.
Right.
That connects to another point, which is, is Obama going to take the statements that he made the other day, which included some positive steps forward, stressing the pre-67 borders, for instance, as the baseline for negotiations. Is he going to take that and operate on that? Or, there's an expression, a Talmudic expression that says the face of the generation is like the face of a dog, and the standard interpretation of that is that a dog runs before you but keeps looking back to see which way you're going. It's a criticism of leaders who act like they're leading but are really following. Mm-hmm. So there's a leadership test involved here. There's September is coming. Obama knows where that's going. He's probably hearing in Europe something about where that's going.
Yeah.
It's going to lead not only to Israel's isolation, but to a great deal of embarrassment for the United States in a multipolar world. And it's going to lead to, as he said explicitly, to AIPAC. Without real peace negotiations, he loses leverage to try to prevent that resolution in the United Nations.
Right.
So the question is whether he's going to, how much of his leverage he's going to use as President of the United States. And one of the ways that he should be using that leverage, and here I'm saying something I've said before, and I'm sorry for repeating it, but he needs to be speaking more directly to the people in the region if he wants to get them to talk to each other, to the Israelis and to the Palestinians. He needs to say some of the things that their own leaders are afraid to say to them. I would recommend to Mr. Obama, if he's serious about this, if he understands what the consequences are, to take a detour on his way back from Europe and come to the Middle East, to speak in Jerusalem and Ramallah, to lay that out, and without saying so in so many words, because of course we wouldn't want him to interfere in domestic politics in the way, for instance, that Netanyahu has interfered in domestic politics in the United States, but to lay out that leaders who do not get on the bandwagon of reaching a two-state solution with all the costs involved are harming their own people. Because one of the effects of that would be to make Netanyahu's political situation in Israel much more, well, let me put it this way, it would sharpen the issues within the Israeli electorate. The last time that happened in a strong way in 1992, I'll be bipartisan here. The person who made that happen was George Bush Sr., with cracking down on the settlement issue, and it led to an electoral change in Israel and to the beginning of negotiations with the Palestinians. So
wait a second. You think Obama actually has the power to change the internal political dynamics in Israel, such that what Netanyahu...
I think it's extremely unpopular in the Israeli context. Once the first 10 minutes of curing are over, it's extremely unpopular for a leader to create a diplomatic crisis with the United States.
Yeah.
Israelis do know that they are, outside of the tinfoil hat Wright, Israelis do know that they are strategically dependent on the United States. They do know that this alliance is the key, is the strategic basis of Israel's position today, and not getting along with America isn't popular.
Yeah, but
it's extremely important.
I don't think that's a problem because Obama surrendered. He went before AIPAC and he reiterated every form conceivable of reassurance about security. And he totally caved to all of Netanyahu's demands, basically. I mean, he said, and he surrendered his leverage by guaranteeing them that he will oppose the September resolution. So, I mean, I don't think it's... is it, you tell me, is it really perceived as a diplomatic crisis in Israel when Bibi Netanyahu comes over here and lectures the American president, and basically the American president says, you're right, I'm sorry? I mean, he didn't say that in so many words, but he went before AIPAC and he clarified his 1967 his point about the 67 lines exactly the way Netanyahu would have wanted him to, and then...
Oh, no, that's not true.
Oh, I think so.
Netanyahu does not want to talk about the 1967 lines. He insists that 1967 is not an issue. The fact that I would agree with you that that Obama was far too wimpish in this respect, but I will also say that the fact that he went before AIPAC and said, I'm insisting on the 1967 lines as the basis for negotiations, was perceived here as, in many ways, as a blow to Netanyahu. Netanyahu's performance at the press conference with Obama was, got a lot of play as an embarrassment. This is an extremely fluid situation. It's not set in stone. There's sort of a double sensibility to what's happened in Washington with Netanyahu, people feeling at the same time that he showed Obama and, wow, we're in trouble with the Americans. and Obama can exploit that if he wants to. Now that leads me to
Netanyahu's
two other players here.
So wait, Netanyahu's address to Congress did not resolve those doubts in Israel? That's not a happy ending for them that Congress lavishes affection on him?
Well, it shows that Congress lavishes affection on him, but it hasn't solved the crisis with Obama. And it's clear that he has a diplomatic crisis with the American administration. And that could either blow over immediately, or it could lead to a tremendous amount of strain for him.
And you're saying Obama should sustain
his previous government in 96 to 99 fell over exactly this kind of situation. He was trying to satisfy the right, and he was trying to deal somehow with the Clinton administration, and he zigzagged, and he lost credibility.
Yeah.
So Obama can either, forget about this and go back to the 87 other issues on his table. I agree. There's a lot else on his table. Mm-hmm. Or he can double down and make it clear that that in looking out for American and Israeli interests, he insists on there being negotiations, and that he really opposes a unilateral UN step. But the only way he can prevent that is negotiations. That's in what he was saying as well.
Yeah, but the problem is that he's a first-term president and he faces re-election, and he's scared to death of the political implications of heightening the confrontation with Netanyahu. I mean, we're back to AIPAC, and I would be, I'm interested in this idea of yours that Obama should, for Israel's own good, heighten basically the sense of diplomatic crisis with the United States, and I'd love to see it. But it's like I keep wishing he would do something like that, but it never happens.
Well, it depends on how much, whether he can think 3 months in the future or 4 months in the future as well, because the situation of the United States being on one side of the table on this issue is, as I said, it leads to greater strain in American relationships abroad as well.
Right.
It's not going to be a comfortable diplomatic situation for the United States.
But that doesn't hurt him in the election, though. If anything, antagonism with Europe helps an America. I'm not kidding. Certainly on the Republican side, it's a badge of honor. I mean...
Okay, but... so what you're telling me is that voters all over the place can be very short-sighted. Let me mention here the two most important keys to this. I've been building from the outside of the concentric circles to the middle.
Okay.
There's two very, very important elements here. One is that the main Israeli opposition party, Kadima, led by Tzipi Livni, has not has been very poor politically at exploiting the situation. They have not been serious. They should be much more on the offensive against Obama, and they should be pointing out that there's one incredibly important thing about the Palestinians seeking recognition for a Palestinian state in the 67 boundaries, which is that if the UN recognizes that, or even recognizes that as a basis for negotiations, it is recognizing Israel's borders with the West Bank and Gaza as international borders for the first time. Up to now, those have been essentially de facto borders.
They were armistice lines.
They were armistice lines. They except for in East Jerusalem and on the Golan Front, they remain the legal boundaries of Israel for the purposes of Israeli law, but their international legal situation is essentially a de facto situation.
The other thing that should be attractive to Israel about that is that it's not the one-state solution.
Exactly. And there have been voices in the opposition who have said this, that have said we should welcome this, but they have not been playing hardball here. Mm-hmm. The other factor here is the Palestinians, and the first small thaw of the Arab Spring in the Palestinian front was pressure from the street. Actually, remarkably small demonstrations that still had the result of pushing Hamas and Fatah together into a unity agreement. That was basically the result of demonstrations by politically unaffiliated young people, particularly college graduates in major Palestinian cities. Okay, they've gotten their unity agreement with all the complexities and the questions that raises. Obama has basically told them that nonviolent protest will have American backing. That's one of the other pretty clear messages of his speech last week. The program of that protest has to be a two-state solution, and the means have to be strictly nonviolent. And that's the Palestinians' way of bypassing Mr. Netanyahu and speaking directly to the Israeli public, and of creating a situation where they can negotiate a solution rather than gambling on an imposed arrangement from outside that could blow up in their faces. Mm-hmm. So the players in the middle of it have the most responsibility. I'm not letting off either Obama or Congress for their embarrassing behavior, but clearly the weight of pushing this thing forward it rests here. One has to wonder whether or not the approach of September will clarify anybody's minds, mm-hmm. and lead to some more productive action.
So you're putting some hope in this prospect raised by the Nakba commemoration that the Palestinians are opting for a nonviolent approach that Netanyahu would have trouble dealing with.
Yeah, I am, and I'm saying that not as pie in the sky. I'm saying that on the basis of conversations with young Palestinians who basically see the Second Intifada as having gotten them less than nowhere, as having led to a lot of suffering, who are sick and tired of the establishment parties for their infighting and want to get to independence. I'm saying that on the basis of polls in the Palestinian public that reveal strong opposition, overwhelming opposition to rocket fire from Gaza. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a mood there that's looking for a way out of this situation. I am certainly not going to make any prophecies of whether somebody is going to succeed in organizing that, or whether they will succeed in conducting a campaign in a sufficiently nonviolent fashion to have the effect that I mentioned on the Israeli public.
Of course, it takes tremendous discipline to remain nonviolent amid a bunch of inherent, inevitable encounters with soldiers who are themselves, nervous and may kind of overreact. And a cynic might say that it is within Netanyahu's power to make sure that the army does things that turn it that make it violent, which would probably be in his political interest. I've got my fingers crossed. I'd love to see peaceful demonstrations.
Yeah, I actually think that your cynicism here, again, in terms of your, viewing this as a chess game in which Netanyahu has played 5 steps in advance, I don't think that's correct. I think what is correct is that were Netanyahu to see those demonstrations, in his own siege mentality, he would not make the distinction between those and a armed threat to Israel's existence, because he's a man who, ironically, with all of his macho talk, is very, very afraid. Mm-hmm. He tends to see all threats in the same scale. On his Richter scale, there's only 8. And he would probably, or there's a risk that he would overreact to that kind of stimulus. So you're right. Mm-hmm. It takes tremendous discipline. If we hadn't seen what had happened in Egypt, for instance, which is the leading country in the region, which is the symbol for the public elsewhere in the Arab world, if we hadn't seen that, we would say it's impossible. Mm-hmm. But what I think at least the initial stage of the Egyptian revolution showed us, and we have no idea what the final stages will be, but the initial stage showed us is that all of the claims that what was done politically in the past must be what will be done in the future, they fell apart in Tahrir Square.
Yeah. It's a fascinating dynamic, and I spoke to a guy in Gaza last week, sadly, I was taping a dialogue that did not see the light of day for technical reasons, but, he said there is something really new going on. I had spoken with him once before, a year earlier. I'd done a dialogue with him, and first of all, I sensed a new self-confidence in him. It was like, it doesn't matter what Israel wants, we're moving, and he was talking about moving nonviolently, and it was also like, it doesn't matter what Hamas wants, it doesn't matter what Fatah wants. He was very much infused with the spirit of, grassroots power, and he said there is much more support for nonviolent activity in Gaza.
Okay, again, the test of this is what happens on the ground. My own sense is I've seen a lot of signs of that. I would also note that 70% of the Palestinian population is under the age of is 29 or younger. Mm-hmm. These old apparatchiks of the liberation movements of the past are distant from the public. They don't have the confidence of younger people, particularly educated younger people. There's a search on for new ways of getting things done. I would stress here that in order to get something done, one major task of any Palestinian movement is to make clear to the public on the other side that their goal is nonviolent achievement of a two-state solution. They need to crack the impression made by the bombs going off on Israeli streets 10 years ago at the height of the Second Intifada. Mm-hmm. Am I, betting my house on that happening? No. Is there a possibility of ways of changing the situation? Yeah, I think there is a possibility.
Yeah, and he said some interesting things in that regard. He said, I don't want to misrepresent him, but he kind of said, look, I'd be happy with a two-state solution, but it looks like we may be moving toward a one-state solution. In other words, if Israel doesn't cede control of what would be the Palestinian state, then eventually you have a majority Arab population, and you know how that story goes. But he also highlighted something for me, which is that there can be a fine line. Here it takes us back to right of return. There's a kind of a fine line between one-state solution on the one hand and two-state solution plus untrammeled right of return, right?
Absolutely.
From Israel's point of view, and this is their fear. And, one thing that I'm not sure people appreciate, I got this from my first conversation with him, is, the right of return is really important to the Palestinians. There is a serious sense of grievance. This is someone whose parents were driven from their home in Israel proper, and he feels the grievance very deeply. And when you talk about land swaps, he says, right, it's like I trade you. You give me New York and I give you an equal parcel of land in a desert in the Southwest or something, And first of all, I just want to say these are kind of natural in a way reactions that we entertain insufficiently, precisely because the Palestinian point of view mainly comes through these people that we kind of pay to be the official Palestinians, if you want to be cynical about it. Really.
They speak English for an interview on TV.
Yeah. So first of all, there's all that, which is clearly a complication, this devotion to right of return. But in this last conversation, I said to him, now suppose you technically granted the right of return, and this is why I think it's important to save this for the negotiations, because you can work things out like this. Suppose you technically granted the right of return, but had various constraints on realizing it, and had a very generous financial compensation package for people who chose not to exercise the right of return, and you had a real declaration from Israel that, look, we're sorry, we understand that bad things happened and we did bad things. And he said that second thing is much more important than the money. He said...
Okay, so part of what's going on here is very deep issues of identity and of people's story about their past and the failure to recognize that story.
Right.
And that is a very important part of the negotiations. Clearly, the Israeli fear in making some kind of recognition of that sort is that it will be immediately accompanied with 1 million refugees coming across the border.
Sure.
So, yeah, I mean, that's where negotiations work, and that's also where an extremely involved outside facilitator is involved. And that brings us back to all of the diplomatic issues that we've raised before. I just point out one more thing. If Obama hopes that he'll put this off to the penultimate year of his second term, he knows himself that the situation is not going to stand still until then for him to deal with that. And there's one last point I'd like to make is that I make this mistake too, we talk about a one-state solution or a two-state solution. Let's get the word solution out of the vocabulary and talk about arrangements. Politics does not lead to perfect solutions. It leads to compromises and arrangements that people can live with. In my view, the two-state arrangement is one that can work, and the one-state arrangement is moving all of the issues that are now going on as diplomatic issues into the internal politics of the state that would be created. The settlement issue won't go away. The refugees returning to their homes won't go away. None of those issues will go away. They'll be the internal politics of a state that in the best situation will look like Belgium, incapable of creating a government, and in the much more likely situation will look like our northern neighbor Lebanon, with constant fighting between the different communities. So that's a disaster. That's what we're trying to avoid. That's why a two-state arrangement is critical for Israel's future and for the Palestinians' future, and that's why people who care about Israel should be working for that kind of arrangement.
Yeah. Final question. We've about run out of time, but what is your position on the reconciliation of Fatah and Hamas? This is another thing Netanyahu said is this is one reason we can't go forward is because so long as Hamas is part of the picture, we won't talk to them. What's your line on that?
Well, look, I have obviously no great sympathy for Hamas. On the other hand, there's this contradiction that goes on that people, including Israeli leaders, have said to Abbas, have said to Fatah, that it's not really serious negotiating with you because you only represent half of the Palestinians. So this agreement is an attempt to get past it. The agreement has not been tested yet. It has not been implemented yet. If the agreement is implemented the way it is written and presented, Abbas will still be in charge of negotiations with Israel. Hamas has said that it's against a two-state solution, but it will accept a vote of the Palestinian people. So essentially what you're talking about in this agreement is a situation in which the Palestinians are saying we're going to have elections in another year.
Right.
The issue at the center of that election is going to be did Abbas's diplomatic strategy lead to Palestinian independence? If it leads to a deal offering Palestinian independence, then the moderates are going to have a huge advantage, and if it didn't, Hamas is going to have a huge advantage. So you can take that agreement as a disaster, or you can take it as, again, as an opportunity to push quickly for a negotiated settlement, without papering over in the least the problems of what Hamas is or what it stands for. I mentioned before the impact that the Palestinian public has on Israeli politics. The Siamese twin of that impact is, the co-joined twin of that impact is the impact that Israeli politics have on Palestinian politics.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think people don't appreciate enough that there are really two separate questions with Hamas. One is, can Hamas change in response to pragmatic considerations? And the other is, will Hamas wind up running the show anyway? Either, if Hamas is not running the show anyway, it doesn't matter if it changes, And there's always a serious prospect of change. And in fact, one of the two Hamas leaders, what's the name of the one who's in Syria?
Mashal.
What's that?
Mashal.
Yeah. I think he said on Charlie Rose, we could live with 1967 borders and right of return. Now, granted, that's that's not attractive to Israelis, and it basically means, as we said, in some ways is tantamount to a one-state solution where Palestinians run the show. But still, that's not an insignificant thing for him to say, because, if right of return remains not negotiated until the end, you can see how he could be creating a path toward, and of course 67 borders per se are not going to be acceptable to Israelis, but still, for him to say that is, I think, something that you could argue you ought to jump on, and say, well, okay, now we can start talking. But it's gotten very little attention, the fact that he said that.
This is not a new comment, and I would stress that the first time that I saw reports of him saying that the reports were in Arabic, not in English. So the claim that he says that to the Americans, but he doesn't say that.
No, but I heard he said it
in Arabic are not true.
I heard he said it. Oh, right. Exactly. Okay. Good point. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Okay.
So I think that the thing that has to be remembered here. This goes back to what we were saying about what people will accept when an agreement is in front of them versus theoretically. This is a dynamic situation, and it can be changed by the actions of the other side. The classic example, it's interesting. The two classic examples of nonviolent change in the Middle East both came from Egypt. Sadat's trip to Jerusalem and the revolution in Tahrir Square. So we're looking for leaders who have the courage to do that, and we're looking for people who can, on the ground, who can create some sort of dynamic. So the question is whether those precedents can be followed.
Okay, well, we should call it a day. Sounds like you're putting your hope in. I guess among the sources of hope are Palestinians will choose a very disciplined form of nonviolence. The young Palestinians, especially, which will change the political calculation. And the other, which I don't think is quite crazy, I think it's unlikely, is that Obama will just say what the hell and double down. I think personally, politically, he would not have nearly as much to lose as he thinks, because the truth is, the people that would most antagonize in America already don't trust him on this issue and probably aren't going to vote for him.
There's a quote which I will not repeat from James Baker, because James Baker was less polite than I want to be on blogging heads or in any other situation. But he referred to the fact that the Jews don't vote for the Republicans anyway. I would reverse that. The likelihood is that the Jews who are totally opposed to a strong American diplomatic effort aren't voting for Mr. Obama anyway.
I agree, and I think that is really underappreciated. I mean, there is separately from that the question from Obama's point of view of the formal deployment, the deployment of money in the election against him, and that's more of an AIPAC kind of organized issue. And as I understand it, right now he's still kind of on good terms with the head of AIPAC. So there's that. But I agree with your basic point. I think he has already lost the people who would be antagonized by his just doubling down and do what you say, going to Israel and Palestine and just talking in very candid terms and not worrying a bit about annoying Netanyahu.
I think you're right.
Okay, well, we've
settled it.
We've settled it. now we can.
Now, if only everybody else could be as sensible as you and as we've been here, then everything would be okay.
Wars. Well, let's go enjoy the peace that now prevails around the world. Now that you and I have done this.
Right. Okay.
All right. Thanks a lot, Gershom.
Thank you.
Take care.